Good morning, good afternoon, welcome. We'll hang out for a bit and see if anybody else joins before kicking off. Thanks for joining early. I'll give it one more minute and then we'll kick off. All right, well, we'll get going. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. This Brunch and Learn session is going to be about cloud cost management and strategies on how you can protect your wallet when you're in the cloud. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. The session is being recorded and a link will be sent out afterwards. And when we are done, you can click the leave button to make sure that you did actually leave. Introduction of myself, I'm Scott Morley. I'm a director of delivery for infrastructure at Argonaut. I've been here for a little over 2 months now, but as you can tell by the gray hair, I've been in IT for a very long time. And I've been doing Azure stuff for a little bit more than a decade now. Been with the Microsoft world since I started. What we're going to be looking at today, we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between cost management and FinOps. They're complementary, and a lot of people, want to get involved in FinOps now. So I'm going to explain a little bit of the difference. We're going to talk about the different clouds that are out there and how cost is handled differently in those. The focus really is going to be on Azure because that's where a lot of the cost management really um, needs to happen. But I'm going to touch on all of the clouds to talk about strategies around cost management there. I'm going to talk about what we spend money on, how we spend it, the different ways that we get billed, so that we understand the kinds of things that we're looking for, so that we can appropriately deal with them. I'm going to touch briefly on landing zones. I did a full landing zone presentation a couple of weeks ago, and we're happy to share that recording if it's something that piques your interest. But I'm going to talk about how they can help with cost management. Then we're going to look at the ways that we can actually save money. Some of the strategies that we can go look at today to see how cost management can be put in place. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can help in your journey. So to start, we'll talk about the difference between cost management and FinOps. So cost management is a very now type thing, right? I want to go in and take a look at what's going on right now and figure out how I can save money. So what am I spending the most on? What am I not using? Those kind of things. FinOps is really more of a discipline, right? A process that we put in place so that as we move forward, we grow our environment, we make changes to it, adopt, that we have things in place so that we can understand why our cost is changing and how we can keep our costs in check. So I am going to show examples of that when I go through how we can do cost management, right? Kind of what the FinOps motion would be in order to make it so that going forward, we don't have to come in and do as much cost management. We never want to give up cost management, right? Even if we have a very strong FinOps practice in our environment, cost management is always a critical component because it kind of feeds into FinOps, right? I need to understand what it is that's going on in my environment before I can put some kind of process around it. So just something to keep in mind. I'm not going to read through these, but I'll give you a second to just kind of browse through so that you can kind of get a feel for what the difference is. Okay. So Microsoft has a whole bunch of clouds. If you go and take a look at their site, they claim to have a lot more than 200. But Xbox is a cloud, Outlook is a cloud, Office is a cloud. So when we talk about the clouds that we review as a business, as an organization, there's really three that we're concerned with. By and large, most companies are going to be using this X365 cloud, right? That's the Office 365, M365, Dynamics 365, Power Platform falls into there. So it's really a lot of the SaaS services that we get from Microsoft. The Azure cloud is where we do all of our kind of custom services, right? We do the infrastructure as a service, SQL databases, AI services, those kind of things. And then kind of joining all of those together is this identity cloud, which a lot of people will lump into the X365 cloud, but it is a separate cloud. There's a different strategy around how we look at the cost, how we manage costs, and things that, well, not sure what happened there. And things that we want to make sure that we're keeping track of, right? So they go all hand in hand, but I want to make sure that it's understood as to where the costs for the identity come from. Okay, so now we'll take a look at the different types of things, right, between those clouds that we're going to be keeping an eye on from a cost perspective. So the X365 world, right, is very much a monthly per user cost. I have a license that I'm going to assign to a user, whether that's a Dynamics license or an Office license, a Copilot license. All of those are generally, by user. And so the cost management there is making sure that we have the appropriate type of license and that we're not over licensed, right? We don't have more than we need, but that we're also taking advantage of what comes with that license. In a lot of cases, especially around the M365 licenses, there's bundled licenses that come included with that. And if we're not taking advantage of those, then we're kind of leaving money on the table, right? So that's more of the FinOps type thing, is to make sure that we're taking advantage of the services that we're actually paying for. Right? Cost management is, how many licenses do I have? Do I have users assigned? And who's keeping track of that, right? Um, One of the other things that you can do from a FinOps perspective here is engaging in the Entra ID services that allow you to manage groups as conduits for that license, right? So you can have dynamic groups that you can create where membership in that group will actually do a license assignment for you. And then you can delegate that group so that the managers actually have control over who is in that group. So you think about, the traditional way of doing things where you hire a user, you have to put a ticket in with IT, they're going to create the user, they're going to put them in the appropriate groups, they're going to assign the license. So there's time, one, that's lost there, but two, there's also kind of this lack of visibility. IT doesn't know, unless somebody tells them, who belongs in a specific group. If you delegate that down to the manager, they know who needs to be in their group. And then if you put that dynamic license assignment on there, then moving somebody in or out of that group is actually going to change the license that's assigned to them. So it really cuts down on that. Oh, well, I bought 30 licenses. I'm using 30 licenses, but I've got these three people that don't really need them anymore because they've changed roles, but I didn't unassign those licenses, right? That's the more the FinOps way of doing things, right? Making so that that license assignment happens automatically. Identity is very similar to X365 in how the licenses are kind of assigned, but there are different flavors. Generally, you're going to be talking about whether you have premium P1 or P2 licenses for Entra ID, and there's services that get unlocked with that, like conditional access and some of that group management I just talked about. Right, it requires that elevated license. So again, keeping track of who has those licenses, very important. But also understanding that assigning that license can actually open up things that you may not want people to be taking advantage of, right? So from a security perspective, understanding that license assignment. And just as an example there, if you're using, M365 E3 or E5, you're getting a premium Entra ID license with that, which can open up capabilities for you that you may think that you need, but you don't realize that you have. So the Entra licenses, the identity stuff, is often where we see stuff that companies could be using and would like to take advantage of, but they don't even know that they have the license. And then last, we talk about Azure. And like I said, the focus of this session is really going to be about Azure because this is where most of the spend has the potential to happen, simply because of the types of resources that are going to be deployed and the scale, right? There's a lot of things you can deploy that you're not really going to have necessarily visibility of unless you put it in place. So from a licensing perspective, pretty easy to audit, right? I just need to go and see what licenses I have and who they're assigned to. But if I'm deploying VMs or scaling my SQL Server, changing my Databricks type implementations and the pipelines that I've created there, there's a lot of tweaks that I can make there that are going to affect my cost. And so that's why we focus most on Azure. So when we look at them, the resources in Azure, most of them are billed uh, on an hourly basis, right? So I stand up a VM, I'm going to start getting billed for it. I shut down that VM, I stop getting billed for it. I delete the VM, that it goes away completely, right? And there's categories in there. So a VM has a network card, it has a storage, right, from the disk drive, those kind of things. So there's a lot of components that come into that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the strategies of how we can make sure that we're looking at things appropriately to understand why we're getting charged what we are. Then there's some resources that are billed on an average, on a monthly average. If I enable backup, I'm not paying per hour for that backup, right? Because it's not something that just constantly runs. I back it up. There's storage that I'm going to be using, but I'm basically going to be billed on an average. So if I start the month with 10 VMs being backed up and I end the month with 20 VMs being backed up, I'm going to get billed for 15 VMs, right? That average is kind of spread out across the month, because Microsoft doesn't really keep track of you backed up this many VMs today. Um, so generally, the billing will stop when the resource is removed, and it starts when the resource is deployed. I'm going to get a little bit more into this in a future slide because there's granularity even to this, right, as to how you can track that spend for those things that you are billed hourly and those things that are billed monthly, that kind of thing. So I'm going to dive into a little bit more, but there's a lot more complexity when we start talking about Azure costs than the rest of them. Okay, so within Azure, so this is the future slide. When we talk about these resources, by and large, the probably 95% of the resources, right, are going to be these hourly consumption. Um, and there's again the distinction between compute, storage, and those are by and large the two biggest costs that you're going to see when you're deploying something. You deploy a SQL Server in Azure as a service, right? You're going to assign compute to it, and that's going to come with a monthly cost. Then you're also going to assign storage. How much data do I actually need? And so you're going to pay for that as a separate cost. And so when you're looking at your bill, and a lot of times you've got to kind of correlate, right? What things are related. You can do that by name. You can do that by tag. I'm going to talk about tagging as a strategy in a bit. But understanding the types of costs that are associated with your resource, very important, because you want to make sure that you've deployed things appropriately, right? If I need a lot of compute, not a lot of storage, then that's something that I can tweak, and vice versa, right? Same thing with VMs. There are VMs that are optimized for different workloads. So making sure that I've deployed the right VM family so that I'm getting the right ratio between memory and storage and CPU power, all of that kind of fun stuff, right? Um, is really where the cost management is. From a FinOps perspective here, there's policies that we can use, which are part of a landing zone. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in depth, but we can make it so that we can only deploy certain types of resources, right? If I know that I have a development environment, as an example, and I want my developers to be able to go out and just make sure that things work, right? But I'm not too worried about performance of them. I can put policies in place that will make it so that they can only deploy kind of those lower end resources that aren't going to cost a lot of money. So they can have multiples of those while they're doing their science experiments. And I don't really have to worry about them breaking the bank, right? No surprise because somebody deployed a business critical SQL Server when we really only needed something that you're testing for development, right? And then at the end of the month, the bill comes and you have to then backtrack and figure out what you did. So policies are a big factor in this, and you can get a little bit overzealous with it, but it's also not just about restricting things, right? It's being aware that these things are happening in your environment. So having a policy doesn't mean it can never be done. It just means that somebody needs to be notified in order to make it happen. So again, if that developer needs to deploy that machine, okay, let's go say, hey, I want to deploy this machine. Then a manager can make the approval, right? And but it's not a surprise at the end of the month. Somebody knows that it's coming. So the second set I've already talked about is kind of backups, right? In Azure Site Recovery, where there's this monthly resource consumption. So in addition to the resources that are being used for that, right? I have a storage account where my backup is being stored, which is tied to a recovery service vault based on the number of backups that I'm doing, that kind of thing. There's this charge just for the backup service, and that's what gets charged at the monthly resource consumption. So again, two things you need to think about when you're doing your backups. What is the amount of storage that I'm going to be doing in a backup, and how many VMs am I going to be backing up? Same thing with Azure Site Recovery. So, when you're looking at your bill, tagging those, making sure that you understand what they're there for, can help you figure out if you're spending the appropriate amount. So then there's this monthly service average, which is tied to a resource. So the the backup falls into this again, from the average, right? So sorry, I actually mixed those up. The monthly service average is the backup. The monthly resource consumption, the example there is Defender for Cloud. So the ones that are the monthly resource consumption, when you turn it on, you pay for the month. I apologize for the confusion there. I reversed these two when I was describing them. So if I go into Defender for Cloud or I turn on Azure Site Recovery, even if it just runs for a day, if I turn it off, I'm going to pay for the full month. So that is not based on the actual consumption like a VM, right? I turn a VM on, I turn it off, delete it an hour later, I only pay for that hour. With a monthly resource consumption like Defender for Cloud or ASR, I'm going to be paying for that for the entire month, whether I turn it off or not. So things that you can do, especially around Defender, if you're interested in seeing what that's going to show you for your security stance, you can turn it on for a month, let it run for a month because you're going to be paying for it, and then turn it off at the end of the month. So you pay for it for a month, you get the full benefit of it for a month, but it's not something that you have to keep running, right? You can then review the recommendations that it makes, turn it off, go back 6 months later, turn it back on, and check your stance. But it's just something to keep in mind that there are things that if you turn it on, even if it's on for 5 minutes, you're going to pay for the whole month. So the monthly service average is the backup, right? And that's where it's going to take a look at what you started with and what you ended with and give you an average bill. And that's because Microsoft just doesn't track those resources individually. But the last one is the service consumption that's not tied to a resource. And the big one here is bandwidth. So with it not being tied to a resource, that means that strategies like tagging and anything else that I can, almost everything else that I can do from a cost management perspective, I'm not going to be able to link that consumption back to a specific resource. So if I, want to understand the difference between how much network traffic is leaving Azure between my dev environment and my production environment, if I have them in the same subscription, there's no way that I can tell the difference. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that strategy when I get to landing zone and how that can help understand, right? But everything else that is listed here is going to be tied to a resource. But bandwidth is the big one. And understanding bandwidth and how it actually works, what it means, is important in understanding that bill. So when you think about bandwidth, a lot of what people will say is it's anything that leaves an Azure region, which is true, right? So if I have VM deployed in West US 2 and I'm talking to a database that's in East US 2, that traffic that goes between those regions, I'm going to pay for because it's actually leaving the region. If I'm pushing things into Azure, so if I've got stuff that I have on premise, as example, a database that I'm mirroring up into Azure and I'm pushing stuff up into Azure, that's free. I never really pay for ingress. Bandwidth is really more egress, right? When you think about it. But there are other things that affect that. Like if I stand up multiple virtual networks and I have a peering between those, I actually pay for the egress on both of those, right? So it's not just the traffic in that case that leaves the region. The peer you pay on either side, a penny for either side, right? I pay for it leaving the network and I pay for it entering the network. So taking some time and understanding the bandwidth one, especially since it's a little bit more difficult to peg to a specific resource, is really going to be worthwhile. And when you're trying to figure out your cost management strategy, The significance of bandwidth is not that big unless you start talking about moving terabytes worth of data, right? If you're moving, a couple of hundred gig or something like that, the bandwidth cost that you're going to see is might be 10, 15, $20, right? It very rarely goes above that. If you start moving terabytes of data a day, that's when it can add up and it becomes really important to understand how you can mitigate that, and if it's something that you need to do, how you can help account for it. And architecture can help limit some of that. But it's kind of a fact of life when you're up in any cloud, right? It's not just Azure that does this. All of the public clouds charge you for this bandwidth thing. Okay, so landing zones. Landing zones are kind of a strategy, right, on how I want to deploy my environment. And like I said, I did another brunch and learn on landing zones a couple of weeks ago, where I went into a lot more in depth what a landing zone is and how you can use it. But from a cost management perspective, it's a big um, factor, right, in how we can split those things out. So I've got a couple of other things that it helps with, just listed here, from segregation of duties, security, observability, being able to see what's in my environment. But from a cost management perspective, going back to my example of bandwidth, right? If I have deployed an appropriate landing zone, then usually my dev environment is going to be in a separate subscription than my production environment. There's a lot of reasons for that, security being one. Right, for that segregation of duties. I don't necessarily want my developers getting into my production environment, but I want to have them access, into my development environment. That whole security construct becomes a lot easier. But for the cost management perspective, it allows me to then segregate the charges as well, because the subscription is a billing boundary. But when I receive my bill, I'm generally going to get one invoice per subscription. Now, depending on who you get your stuff from, it may come in a consolidated bill, but the details, if you go looking for them, are there by subscription. So something like that bandwidth charge that you can't tag to a resource, if you have your dev environment in a separate subscription, then all of the bandwidth charges that you see on that subscription, they're going to be for your dev environment because that's the billing boundary, right? And so when you're thinking about how to set up your environment so that you have the best visibility, the best opportunity to look at the costs and understand what it's doing, implementing an appropriate landing zone can really help there. Right, it's going to simplify a lot of things by thinking about how you deploy it ahead of time. The other thing that a landing zone will do, I talked about those policies, right? So it makes it a lot easier to implement those policies based on those categories of services, right? I may want a much more restrictive environment from a security perspective in my production subscription, but where I may not be so concerned about the types of resources that I deploy there because it's much more controlled, right? Fewer people can go in and deploy things. So I want them to be able to deploy what's appropriate for my production environment. If I have a server that ends up needing to expand or change because of a performance issue, I don't necessarily want to deal with policy in order to make that change, right? I need to expand it. It's production. I need to do it now. But in the development environment, it may be, the reverse of that. You may have a little bit less, uh, more lax security environment so that your developers can do what they need to do and experiment. But I may want to have better cost controls there so that I know that my developers aren't accidentally doing something that's going to break the bank. And a good example here is, and I've actually had couple of customers that this has happened to in my life, where somebody has gone in, and a lot of it is on pipelines, right? Data pipelines specifically that this happens with, where somebody makes a change and they don't realize the impact of the change that they're making, right? They click the wrong button, that kind of thing. And this was a couple of years ago. There was a customer that their data engineer went in and changed the pipeline so that it would run every minute instead of once a day, and their bill went from $2,000 a month for the subscription. They got billed over $90,000 on in that day that change was made. We were able to go to Microsoft and show to Microsoft, hey, this was a mistake, and there was some credits that Microsoft gave. But that kind of thing, if there was a policy in place, it would not have allowed them to make that change. And so, right, that's what I mean by understanding what the environment needs to look like, the types of things that are going to cost you money. If we build policies around that, that can really make it so that that accidental change can't be made, right? Somebody went and clicked save when they changed it to a minute, policy would have blocked it. but it said, no, that's not a valid value, do something different. And then that person would have went, oh, wait a minute, I didn't want it every minute, right? I wanted it every day. But with landing zones, those policies, we can a lot more easily deploy and control what situations, what subscriptions they go to, right? So when I talk about that development environment, the production environment, I can use landing zones to deploy those policies across multiple subscriptions, as long as they fit that categorization, right? Things like data sovereignty, all of that from a policy and control perspective can be handled through landing zones. So this is really a FinOps thing, right? Where I'm defining my environment so that it's going to support the cost control that I need. Going in and taking a look at the landing zone deployment, not a cost management thing, right? It can help in my review because I can roll up costs through a landing zone. So if I have two, three, four subscriptions that I've defined as dev subscriptions, and I have them in a landing zone, I can go and look at the landing zone and say, show me the cost for all of my subscriptions rolled up, and then I don't have to worry about exporting them and doing it manually, right? So there's still benefits that can happen from a landing zone, but I'm generally not going to start my cost management by looking at the landing zone itself. I'm going to use it as a tool to provide me that observability into what I need to be looking at. Okay, so this is simplified version of the landing zone. This is a Microsoft document, but if you go and actually find this document, there's a lot more resources in here. But from our conversation today, right, from a cost management perspective, the point that I want to make with this is that we can start categorizing things. So I talked a little bit already, right, about the difference between dev, prod, that kind of thing. But if I have additional things that are going on in my environment, I've got partners that are in working on things. I've got security compliance, some of my identity stuff. From a cost management perspective, keeping track of those things easily is definitely helpful, right? I want to understand what kind of bill, the work that I'm doing with my partner and the resources that my partner is deploying. I want to understand what that cost looks like. Put in a different subscription. It's very easy to then go find, right? I don't have to worry about drilling down to specific resource groups or that kind of thing to try and find my cost. And tagging, again, can be used here, right, where I can now use policy to set up default tags. So a lot of customers, when they start using tagging in order to track their billing, they want that tag to be applied to every resource. And we start breaking things out into resource groups for, for compute, some for networking, some are in databases, those kind of things. And we put them into different resource groups as a categorization, but we can also then use those resource groups to enforce that tagging. So through policy, we can make it so that tags have to be there, one, so you can't create a resource group without putting an appropriate tag on it. And then we can also deploy another policy then that says anything that is in that resource group has to inherit the tag that's on the resource group. And so when you get your bill and you're looking at it, everything will have a tag, right? Because the policy is there to enforce it. And it, again, can cause some issues when you're trying to deploy things, and there's some strategies you need to put in place if you're going to put those policies there to enforce it. But it's strategies that we can help with. We've helped a lot of customers go through that to make sure that they understand how their tagging can work for an effective cost management and FinOps review, right? But having that subscription structure in place, again, can help because we can't tag bandwidth, right? So you want to understand the bandwidth that's being used by your identity or by your partner subscriptions, and put them in a subscription, and that will 100% tell you that that bandwidth is being used by that set of resources. Okay, so what's the benefit? Why am I actually going through this, right? There's some discipline that's involved in doing this cost management and FinOps. So what do I get out of it? A lot of it is the lack of surprises, right? I've talked about some customers that have had issues where they've been surprised by their bills. And so going through this cost management discipline on a regular basis, and it doesn't need to be daily or weekly, right? If your environment doesn't change very much, then it's something that you could do quarterly or biannually even. But it's really about understanding what it is that you're getting billed for, and the environment generally is going to change, right? Day over day, month over month, you're going to add things, you're going to subtract things. Microsoft's going to release new products that you want to take advantage of. And so putting that framework in place where I have a regular cost management review and the start or a very mature FinOps practice where I've got policies and all of that kind of thing that are going to help me review this on a regular basis and notify me when something happens. That's the benefit, right? It's the lack of surprises. And so what it does is it makes sure that you can see what's going on. It makes sure that what you're spending money on, you're aware of and it's intended, right? It's not, oh, I didn't know I was doing that. And so I've got this bill now that I have to justify, and I can go fix it going forward. But how long have I been spending this money on this thing that I wasn't even aware was there? It also allows for a quick response to deviations. So one of the biggest things that you can do and the easiest things that you can do from a cost management perspective is set a budget. I can go into any subscription and I can actually even do it at the resource group level now, and I can set a budget. And I can say, I want to get notified if there's any deviation from that budget. So if I know historically I'm spending $2,000 a month on a specific subscription, I can set a budget, right, of $2,000 or 2,500 if I want to allow for a little bit of flexibility, right? Being billed hourly, your cost is going to change month to month, right? There's fewer days in February than there are in March, and so your February bill is always going to be lower than your March bill, even if you don't change resources, right? So there's a little bit of flexibility that you need to build in there. But having that budget there, you can turn on notifications. Let me know when I get 50% of my spend, 75% of my spend, 90% of my spend. Let me know, every day if I'm over. And in the case of certain subscriptions, you wouldn't want to do this on production. There's even the ability to shut off the subscription if it goes over budget, right? So if you have a development subscription and you know your budget is $2,000 a month, if you hit 2,500, you can actually have the subscription suspend. When the month resets and therefore the billing resets, that subscription becomes active again and it will start billing again, right? So you can get pretty intense with how you manage that budget. Again, I wouldn't recommend it on a production subscription. But having that in place allows that quick response for deviations, right? The customer that I was talking about, if they had a budget in place and their budget was $3,000, they would have been notified well before they hit that $90,000 range that something was going wrong, right? Because they would have got notified a couple of minutes later, hey, your budget's at 50%, maybe an hour later, hey, your budget's at 90%. And then an hour later and every hour thereafter, hey, you're over budget, right? And somebody can see that then and go look at it right away so that they could figure out what was wrong and stop it so they don't accumulate that astronomical bill. And the customer that I'm talking about, it actually took them 2 days to figure out that what was going on because they didn't have a budget in place. So the total they racked up in those 2 days was somewhere around $175,000. And like I said, we worked with Microsoft because it was clearly an error and not something that they had done intentionally. And Microsoft gave them most of that money back. But that just the fact that Microsoft does that doesn't mean it's something that you can count on, right? That's a very reactionary thing, and it took a while. It took a couple of months for Microsoft to actually, refund them that money, but they wanted to have their subscription running, so they had to pay it, and then they got the credit, right? So thinking about budgets, thinking about policies, right? They can really help you um, have some peace of mind that kind of thing is less likely to happen to you. And at the end of the day, what it really shows you is the value that you're getting out of the cloud, right? Companies that move to the cloud, if they think they're just going to save money, they need to think a little bit differently about it, right? There's a lot of things that change from an infrastructure perspective, architecture, consumption, all of that when you move into the cloud. So cost savings is not guaranteed. You can structure it depending on how much modernization you do that you can save money compared to on-prem, but you really have to justify that value, right? What am I getting out of moving to the cloud? And so going through this cost management and making sure that everything that you're spending money on is what you expect and intend to spend money on can help you justify that value, right? No, we really do need to spend that money because we're still running on VMs and we need to have a higher SLA, right? So I have to deploy 2 VMs instead of one. There's value there. There's uptime guarantee, right? But that comes with an additional cost. So explaining that value is really what you're trying to get to. People that just look at costs and go, "Well, I'm spending more," they're missing some of the picture, right? You may be spending more, but you're getting the value, right? The difference between buying a tricycle and a 10 speed, there's value there, right? Tricycle is going to be cheaper, but the 10 speed can get you a lot places a lot faster, right? A lot more places faster. So that's where the value comes in, right? It's not just about the spend. It's what am I getting for that spend? And having this in place can really help you explain that. Okay, so what are some of the things we can do to save money? I've talked about a lot of things that, we go and look at how much we're spending, but knowing how much we're spending is only half of the battle, right? I need to make sure that I'm taking advantage of all of the things that Microsoft offers in order to save money and base architecture even, right? Am I doing it right? So a lot of the things that Microsoft offers around savings plans, and I'm going to use that as a generic term because there is actually a thing called a saving plan that you can put in place, are going to involve some kind of commitment. And a lot of companies look at that and they go, no, I can't do that. I don't know enough about my Azure resources that I want to be to commit for a year. I'm worried that I may have to change them, that kind of thing. There's a lot of things that we can do to remediate those reservations and that commitment so that it's not as ironclad as you may think it is when you start reviewing it. So I'm going to go over the types of commitments that you can make to help you save money. And this is just a brief example, right? I think there's something like 30, maybe it's 25, 30 different types of reserved capacity that you can put in place. And so if you're interested in that, just ping me and I'll send you a link to where that list of services can be found from Microsoft. But generally what you're going to be putting that reservation on is compute and storage, right? Those are the two big things. I talked about those earlier on as being kind of the two big things that you're going to be spending money on. So it makes sense that those are the two big things that you can save money by committing to it. The philosophy here from Microsoft is that just like anything, right, that's subscription based, if I commit to something, then I can kind of trust that I'm going to have a certain amount of revenue from that, and that's going to let me invest. It also lets me know where I need to invest, right? If I have a bunch of companies that have committed to a specific type of resource, whether that's a SQL Server or a VM or something, then I have to make sure that I have that capacity in my data center, right? So it lets Microsoft know what they can invest and where they can invest it. And so when I go and look at the resources that I have, uh, virtual machines, databases, the storage around that, whether it's just raw storage or it's the storage that's associated with backup plan or the VM disks, if I know I have an idea of the types of those things that I'm going to be keeping running consistently, then I can go and get reservations for those. Now, there's really only two schools of thought from a resource uh, planning perspective around cost from Microsoft's point of view. Either the resource runs all the time and you put a reservation on it, or if it's not something that's needed all the time, you put automation in place to make sure that it shuts down when you no longer need it. Right. If I have a VM that a developer is using, right, and the developer is only using that machine 10 hours a day, then the other 14 hours a day, I'm wasting money on it, right? It's not being used. It's just sitting there completely unutilized. So shutting that down when the developer's done with it, and then starting it up a little bit early so it's available for the developer when they're ready to log in and start using it, that's going to save me 13 hours worth of billing on that machine every day. And when you think about, those machines, even if you look at them independently, right, as a $400 a month machine, that's $200 a month. If I do that across a bunch of developers for 2 years, it's a significant savings, right? So understanding that utilization pattern and what my options are for starting, stopping the resources is going to be really important when trying to figure out whether I need a reservation or not. There are some services in Azure you can't stop. Once it's deployed, right? You deploy a firewall, you can't turn that off. It's going to run 24/7. You don't even have the option of shutting it down. So taking a look at those kinds of things and saying, well, I know this is running. I know I need it. Let me see if I can put some kind of reservation on it to help me save that money. And the way that the rollover works, what I was talking about, right? Microsoft allows you to cancel reservations. So if I commit to a year, And then 3 months later, I say, you know what, this is a completely wrong thing that I want to do. I've got to go a completely different way. I want to move from a VM to platform as a service or something like that. You can cancel those reservations depending on how soon after you created the reservation. There's a restocking fee where Microsoft will charge you maybe a month, right? Because they're giving you a discount for being there for that year. But it's not something you have to worry about paying for that whole year. And there's a difference between a 1 year and a 3 year reservation, right? If you commit for 3 years, then you're going to save more. That Microsoft will give you a bigger discount on it, but that cancellation still applies, right? If I commit to something for a year, 9 months later, I change my mind, I can still cancel it. There's a limit as to how much you can cancel in a year. I think it's currently $50,000 worth of value, but it's not necessarily the full spend, right? It's what Microsoft will give you as a savings. So when you're looking at that cancellation, and if you're interested in getting into this reservation, going through and reviewing that cancellation policy, and we're happy to help kind of explain how it works, is going to be important for you, right? To make sure that you're comfortable and confident that when you go deploy these things, that you understand it. But if you've got things that you've been in Azure for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and they're just running and you've got no intention of changing them, a reserve capacity is going to be a game changer from your cost perspective. And you can see some of these things. Microsoft will actually tell you the things that it thinks you should have these reservations on. So if you go into the Azure portal and you look up Advisor, there's a section in Advisor. It's a great tool to go to anyways, even if you're not specifically looking at cost. It'll talk about resiliency. It'll talk about security. It talks about cost. There's a lot of things that the Advisor tool will make recommendations around. And we help a lot of customers understand those things, because just because Microsoft recommends it doesn't mean it's something that will be the best thing for you to do, right? So interpreting those recommendations, we've got a lot of experience with. But going in and looking in there, it'll give you an idea. How much can I actually save on what's currently deployed if I went to a reservation? Now, you have to take what they offer with a grain of salt, because they're going to tell you this is what you're going to save if you go to a 3 year commitment. You may not want a 3 year commitment. You may want a 1 year commitment. So you can tweak some of those settings so that you can see, a more appropriate um, cost savings if you implemented some of those changes. So the reserve capacity is on a specific type of machine, right? Or a specific resource. It's going to be on, if you're looking at a VM, then you can put a reservation on a D family or a D4 family, right? So it's very specific. What I'm looking at. Same thing with the SQL Server. It's going to be a specific type of SQL Server, business critical, right, or standard, something like that. So you're going to pick a type of resource, and you're going to put the reservation on that. And by doing that, Microsoft will give you a higher level of savings, right? 30, 40, 50%, depending on the year and the type of resource that you make the commitment on. But you can start saving some significant money there. But there's strategies, especially around VMs, as how you can make that a little bit more flexible, so that you can put a reservation on a family instead of a specific VM type. And then you can flex between the number of CPUs that you're running, and the reservation will still apply. And again, policies can help with that. If I've got a reservation right against a family type, say a D series, then I can put a policy in place that says, if you're going to deploy into this specific region, right, central US, it's got to be a D series, because then we're going to take advantage of the reservation. Somebody may need an E-series for a database or something like that. You create an exception to the policy and go deploy the E-series, and then you take a look at it to see if you need to get a different reservation. But using policies, again, through the landing zone, is something where you can help kind of guide that reservation utilization, right? Where you make sure that the commitment that you're making is actually being honored, and you take advantage of it. So the second option there is a savings plan, which is a kind of a generic compute savings, right? So I talked about VMs and SQL servers, and there's a couple of other resources that are out there, right? Fabric stuff that are going to have some compute capacity associated with it. If I'm not sure what I want to do with my environment, if it's fluctuating, if it's a dev environment and the types of resources change all the time, but I know that I've got stuff that's going to be running in there all the time, I can go to a savings plan. A savings plan is going to get me less of a savings, right? The percentage is 15, 20%, depending on the level and how long you commit, those kind of things. But what it does is it takes a look at all of the compute resources that are not tied to a reservation. So the reservation will always kind of take precedence, right? So if I've got as an example, 10 cores that I have running, and I have reservations on 4, the savings plan is going to look at the other 6 and say, okay, what are you actually spending on that? You committed to a certain amount of money, so I'm going to save you, I'm going to give you a discount on that, right? So the reserve capacity is on a resource type, right? I want to deploy 4 of these resources. The savings plan is on a dollar amount. So I tell Microsoft, I know I'm going to spend at least $3,000 on compute every month. And so on that $3,000 that you committed to, Microsoft will give you a discount. So instead of spending 3,000 on that, you spend maybe 2,700, right? Anything above that 3,000, you're going to pay the full value on. So when you think about the tiers of reservations and how you can save money, right? You go from reservation on a specific workload, then you can go to a reservation on a family of workloads, then you can go to a savings plan. And then again, if it's not being used, just turn it off, right? You really don't want to put any kind of reservation on something that you're going to be turning off on a regular basis. So different levels of commitment, different values of what you're looking at, right? So if you're really not sure what you're deploying, savings plan at a bare minimum is something that you should be looking at. Even if you just commit to $2,000, right, or a very low amount, and you want to make sure that you're not going to go under, right, in that February month when you're spending less. You don't want to overcommit that, right? You don't want to have a savings plan for $3,000 and you drop down to 2,800 in your spend, because then you're wasting money on your savings plan. So there's some strategy in math that we can help with, and we do it a lot better than just napkin math. We have planners and that kind of thing that we can help you understand how to take the best advantage of these offerings that are there. And so I've talked about how we can help, all along. Organo's been doing this for quite a while. Myself, like I said, I've been doing it for more than a decade, helping customers understand this. Microsoft Advisor is there, and we know how to interpret it and understand the business case, right? Because again, if all you're doing is looking at cost, you're missing out on it, right? So we're going to help you understand the value. What is it that you're getting out of this spend? Is it something that you can reduce? Get a reservation on, change the way that it's being done, right? Help you understand all of the different facets um, of things that are out there, especially with underutilized or unutilized resources, right? In a lot of cases, especially when you have a development team and they're out doing science experiments, engineers not very good at cleaning up after themselves, right? I'm an engineer. I can attest to that. I'm not calling anybody out. I do it myself. And so having that governance in place and helping you kind of track that down, right? Let's do an audit every month to make sure that what's there is actually still being used. And if not, let's clean it up. So there's a lot of things that we can help with just outside of what Advisor is going to show you, right, as the recommendations that Microsoft makes. And we do it across all the clouds, right? It was started, like I said, I talked a lot about Azure here. Generally, companies aren't going to have a $90,000 unexpected charge on their Microsoft licensing, right? Not unless somebody did something really silly, like said they wanted 300 licenses instead of 30. But across all of the clouds and understanding the license types and again the FinOps things that we can put in place from group management and auto assignment of licenses, that kind of thing. We'll look at your entire environment and help you understand where you can save money. And that is what I have. Thank you for your time. I haven't been paying attention to chat, sorry. If anybody has put any questions in the chat, I'll be happy to answer them. If anybody has any questions about anything, now's a good time. You can put them in the chat, or you can reach out to me directly afterwards and we can help you understand anything that you'd like to go a little bit more in depth in. If there are no questions, then we can wrap this up. Thank you very much for your time.